Snow of Sprinter Overland Commander of the Night's Watch, Protector of the North Bay Area. Winter is coming, and we know what comes with it, and we cannot face it alone.
You're being really dramatic. I thought that's why we got this heater.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Roll the intro. What is up, my party people? Behind that camera is Colleen and I am Todd, and in my hands today I hold the key piece of German engineering that's going to keep our buns nice and toasty through the winter months. This is the Espar Airtronic S2 D2L Heater. Whoa, that's a mouthful. This thing is tiny, it is lightweight, but do not let that fool you. It packs a serious punch. This thing outputs 7,500 BTUs, and it's a combustion heater, which means that it slowly sips diesel off the van's main fuel tank at a maximum rate of 0.1 gallons per hour. Let's do a little bit of math to put that into perspective. Divide by 10, carry the 1. That is 10 hours of hot heat per gallon of diesel at its maximum output. Another sweet feature about this particular model is that it auto adjusts for altitudes up to 9,900 feet. We're going to be installing this in the classic position under the passenger's seat, so follow along as we turn up the heat.
Okay, I have everything laid out here according to this diagram in the manual. There's the heater in the middle, and on top of that is the gasket that will seal underneath it. This stainless steel flex hose is where the fumes go when they get tired, aka exhausted through the muffler and out. This black hose is the combustion air intake. Now we're going to zoom in a little bit. Alright, there's quite a few of these little hose pieces. Basically every transition from each component gets one, and they are used to connect those components to the semi-rigid blue transfer fuel line. The first ones go from the aux fuel tap, then into the pump, which transitions back to another hose piece, into the fuel line yet again, and into the final hose adapter into the heater. Say that 5 times fast. So you may or may not need these next bits and bobs. This white piece is a step-down adapter, but since I bought the Heatso Sprinter kit, I didn't end up needing it. The second piece is what allows a direct connection into the aux fuel port on the van's diesel tank. I'll put the link in the description for both these babies below. Moving right along, if we zoom out, we've got this here elephant trunk, which is responsible for what we all came here for, diverting that sweet heat into the van. And last but not least is the electrical harness spooled up here like an electric eel, which turns on the heater with electric feel. This first pigtail is the main power, whereas the second one with the MCON pins is the pump control, and the last one with the mate and lock connector is the one that plugs into the EasyStart controller. Well, that wraps up the overview, so let's turn it over to me to get the install going.
Alright, so step number 1, we got to remove the seats. We're going to do it the same way we did in the swivel install video where we disconnect the battery first. I just pulled the van in the driveway, so as you remember, I got to let it sit for about 20 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and set that timer now. Hey Siri, set a timer for 20 minutes.
Searching the YouTubes for how to build plenty of tin hods.
Tim Apple strikes again. Removing the seats is pretty simple. Once you've undone the electrical connection, all you need to do is remove the 4 bolts from the corners, whether you have swivels or not. If you're interested in seeing how I remove the stock seats, go check out the swivel video for more information. That swivel is freaking heavy.
Here we are under the van looking up where the passenger seat is, and you can see this unique shape that looks awfully familiar. Let's jump up inside the van to show you what I'm talking about. Alright, we're back in the van and we're looking down in the passenger seat box. This is the front of the van, and you can see there's that shape we were talking about that we could see underneath in the floor panel. Let's take our handy dandy gasket here, and wow! Isn't that a coincidence that that fits so well right there? Almost like a puzzle piece. Let's jump back under the van and see if we go at this location if there will be any issues. Okay folks, I got this baby held up here and you can see everything clears beautifully. This is the position we are going to go with. Now before we go drilling holes in this here vehicle, it's important to get the gasket orientation correct. You'll want the side that has the recess to be facing down towards the heater, and then you'll see this extra little hole here. That's for the fuel line. You'll want to make sure that's in the right location, just like that. The last things you'll want to verify is that the fan and the actual heater output are oriented in the right direction, with the heater output facing the rear of the van. And then if you imagine we flip this thing over for the install and pull the gasket straight off as is, all our holes will be in the exact locations that we need them to be.
Alright, now that I got the gasket set, I'm going to go ahead and mark all these holes with this Sharpie. Alright, and then I'm just going to do one more sanity check to make sure everything checks out. Really my biggest concern is the fuel port here, making sure that that hole is right. So if I flip this over with my orientation correct, yes, I can indeed see that the fuel port ends up being on this side of those two pipes, which is where I have it marked here. So I think we're good to start drilling.
So I have everything marked here from the gasket, and to find the center on these smaller circles it's pretty easy because of their size. However, with the larger circles it's a bit more difficult, so I used one of my favorite trigonomic methods. Shout out to my high school math teacher, Mr. Morris. Basically how this works is if you draw two straight lines that connect any 2 points on the circle and draw perpendicular lines through the midpoint of those original lines, the intersection of these new lines is circle center. This all works because, well, triangles. And as our boy Pythagoras says, a triangle is always a love triangle if you love triangles. Alright, the last thing you want to do before you drill is get yourself a nice center punch. This one is made by Starrit. I'll go ahead and put a link in the description below. What this allows you to do is punch a divot in the metal for each circle center that gives a place for the drill bit to rest, which helps reduce the chances that it will wander. For the initial hole sizes, I used a set of digital calipers to take measurements of the heater intake and exhaust, the mounting bolts, and the fuel port. For the mounting bolts, I initially went with a G-size drill bit, which is a standard clearance for M6 bolts. I did, however, have to open these up a bit, which I'll cover a little bit later. For the diesel fuel line, I started with a number 7 bit, and I also used this to pilot the two larger holes. And then I cleaned everything up with a trusty chamfer bit.
Oh hey, here's a Todd tip for you. It's a Todd tip! When drilling these two larger holes, get yourself one of these. This is a step drill bit. It works way better than a hole saw. They're actually pretty cheap too. I'll link it in the description below. It's actually marked here, but I'm gonna go ahead and Sharpie line that guy just so we know. The other cool thing about this bit is you can see in between each transition it's kind of chamfered here, so that automatically gives you that built-in chamfer bit to deburr the holes afterwards.
Here I'm drilling down a bit at a time and then checking the Sharpie mark for wear. When we are at the correct size, the mark will start to fade from the friction against the metal. Once I was done drilling holes to size from the top, I then went under the van and cleaned up the holes I was able to access below.
Oh hey, here's another Todd tip for you. It's a Todd tip! If you're going to be doing work under the van, you'll at least want two things. First is this bad boy. It's called a creeper. I know what you're thinking, it, not me, okay? The second thing is you want all-around safety goggles like these. They're so hip, they're so fashion, but more importantly, they're going to protect you from debris falling down. The other thing you can do is slightly offset yourself from the work. Remember, gravity is not your friend under here.
For the holes that I couldn't deburr from under the van, I used a deburring tool from inside. In hindsight, it would have probably been better to use a 90-degree drill or a U-joint attachment from underneath, but this worked well enough. It just required some extra muscle, which is no issue because I always have plenty to spare. After everything was cleaned up, I went in for a quick fit check and... unfortunately, it didn't fit.
Alright, so after I drilled my holes, I went to install this thing, and well, it turns out the gasket is not a very good representation of where these line up. You can see how far that one's off, and then because this is like stretched to meet the other ones, it's not really lining up. So I have another small step bit, and I'm basically drilling the holes for the screws and the little fuel line here one step up at a time and checking the fitment.
Once I knew I was close, I started going under the van and pinpointing specific problem children and focusing solely on those. For the sake of a data point for you folks, I went back and measured what I had to open up the holes to in order to get the heater to fit. They were between 0.32 inches and 0.35 inches. I then went ahead and cleaned up everything with a vacuum, making sure to remove all the metal chips from the passenger seat box. Here I have some isopropyl alcohol. I'm just cleaning everything up and getting it ready for paint.
Alright, now that everything's cleaned up, I've gone ahead and sprayed this automotive primer into this cup, and I'm going to use a dauber this time, a little bit more suitable for holes, and I'm just going to prime around this area.
For this part, you want to make sure you just cover all the exposed metal.
Alright, now that the primer's had a chance to dry, I'm going to go ahead and take this red RTV silicone sealant. This is the highest temperature stuff you can buy, and I'm going to apply it all around the gasket and then install this thing down in the holes. Let's get to it.
I see a lot of people put their sealant down on the van. I'm choosing to do it on the gasket instead. The reason why is I don't want any chance of getting sealant in the fuel port. If I did end up building the seal on the van, I could accidentally touch that when I'm trying to guide the heater down into the holes. It's pretty much a blind operation, so this made a lot more sense to me. Another thing I found to be pretty helpful during this step was this popsicle stick. There are a few areas where the nozzle on the sealant doesn't really fit in between the components on the heater, so by using this you can kind of push the sealant into those areas. This is what it looks like under the van after the install. According to the sealant instructions, I'm going to hand tighten the nuts and washers and let it dry for 1 hour before tightening all the way and adding more sealant under the van here. And here's everything tightened down. According to the Espar manual, the torque spec for these nuts is 5 Newton meters. After I torqued it down, I added a bit more sealant. It's hard to make this look pretty, so just focus on coverage. Now we're going to install the fuel line. There are a few extra parts here that are not included in the Heatso kit. First up is the Dorman 800-188 aux fuel quick connect. This is how we'll tap into our van's fuel tank. Second is the Dorman 47309 universal adapter piece. Since I bought the Heatso Sprinter kit, I actually don't think I need this because it came with this hose adapter that steps directly down from the quick disconnect to the fuel hose. I also bought 2 types of jacketing to add another layer of protection for the fuel hose. One is a split loom rated to 200 degrees F, and the other is a stainless steel sleeve rated to 500 degrees F. I didn't really have a plan for where I was going to route the fuel line, so I bought both just in case, and we'll link both of them in the description below. So the fuel line will go from the aux tap into the Heatso adapter. A piece of blue fuel line will be used to bridge that connection to the next hose that gets attached directly to the pump. The pump gets mounted to the van with this rubber shock mount by sliding the pump through the opening. They also include a 90-degree bracket if you want to mount the pump to a horizontal frame component of the van. but we won't be using this because we're mounting ours directly to a vertical face. Finally, we'll go from the fuel pump to another hose adapter into the blue fuel line one last time before tying off at the heater with this last hose adapter. For the management of this line, they did only include one hose clamp in the kit. I had to buy another one of these for a total of 2, which you can also find linked below. I'm going to go ahead and assemble some of this stuff not under the van. I have the Heatso adapter and 2 ABA clamps and the Dorman auxiliary tap fitting. I went ahead and attached these 2 components together and tightened the clamp to the recommended spec of 1 Newton meter. Next step was to add the blue fuel hose. I marked the depth since there's no stop on it and lubricated it just a bit with isopropyl alcohol. After that, I inserted the tube and then I lined up the 2 clamps to make it look profesh and again tightened to 1 Newton meter. Under our van, this is where the auxiliary fuel port is. You simply remove the cap and we can attach the piece we just made.
Okay, just like that. And then now we gotta figure out where we want to send this fuel line. I think that I want to go something like this and maybe mount the fuel pump right in this area. So let's go assemble the fuel pump and get it down here and see what we can do.
I have the fuel pump set up here with a hose segment on each end. It's important to note the directional arrow on the connector. This should point away from the fuel tank and towards the heater. I have this pump right about where I want it, so I'm going to mark the location and drill the pilot hole. For the pilot hole, I'm using a number 16 drill bit, which is 0.177 inches. I chose this based on a metal screw that was included in the Heatso kit. I put a set of calipers on its minor diameter and it measured 0.1895. I went undersized a bit since you can always remove material but you can never add it back. This ended up being perfect for this screw. A quick little kiss with the chamfer bit to clean things up, and we're ready to mount this thing. I used the same silicone sealant as before and coated the screw. This will help with rust and keep moisture out of this hole. I then installed the pump, taking note of the requirements from the manual that it can be mounted between 0 and 90 degrees, but performs most optimally from 15 to 35 degrees. Once the pump was mounted, I could route the fuel line service loop and mark the location where it needed to be cut. You'll want to get yourself a nice pair of these tube cutters to make quick work of a job like this. I then installed the line and tightened the hose clamp down.
Alright, here's this. This is split loom, so you can put it on after the fact. And I'm gonna go with something about right there.
The split loom acts as just an extra layer of protection for the fuel hose. Continuing on, we'll again mark the depth, apply a bit of ISO to lube things up, insert the tube, and then tighten down the next hose clamp. For the routing, I'm going to continue on straight over the drive shaft and make use of this M10 by 1.5 hole that already exists in the van. The whole point is to drill as few holes as possible. However, an M10 is a bit large for the hose clamps we have, so I'm going to fire up the lathe and make an adapter out of a stainless steel bolt I had. So let's turn on some tunes, because here comes a
machine shop montage.
Here's what we ended up with, which is basically an adapter from M10 1.5 to M6 1.0. You can actually buy something very similar to this off the shelf, so I'll link that in the description below. Anyways, let's go check out how we put this to use. Here's the final routing for the fuel line. The aux port is right there. and then it loops around to the fuel pump and goes over the drive shaft and is held by our little adapter and cable clamp. Here's a close-up of that. And then it continues on over the exhaust to one more of our adapters and clamps, and then comes down under the frame member and then up to terminate at the heater. I did end up going with the split loom, mostly because it's used everywhere, including places that are even closer to the exhaust. I did something a little bit different for the air intake routing. I first tightened it to the spec of 3 Newton meters using the clamp provided with the kit, and then when I was messing around with potential routing locations, I found the tube fit perfectly in this frame hole. I read the manual back to front, and this is a legit way to mount this thing. In fact, the only constraints here are, first, that it has to be longer than 20 centimeters, which it is. Second, it shouldn't point in the direction of vehicle travel, which it isn't. And finally, if the tube doesn't maintain a constant downward slope, a 5mm hole must be drilled at its lowest location to bleed off any condensation, which I've done. And in my mind, that 5mm hole is a lot smaller than if the included debris guard was pointed down instead. Finally, this frame member is really long and hollow, so there's always an abundance of fresh air. For the exhaust, I didn't like the idea of exiting at the sliding door, since that's how we get in and out of the van on most occasions. So I decided to route it forward and exit about 4 inches behind the front passenger fender. There was a limited length of exit hose included with the kit, so I attached that to the muffler and mounted it first. I then dry fit the rest of the exhaust piping. You'll want to pre-bend it a little bit to get your route, and then add about 1 to 2 inches to the cut beyond where you mark. I used a hacksaw to get the cut initially started and then finished it off with tin snips. I then tightened the exhaust to the heater using the included hose clamp and the recommended torque spec of 7 Newton meters. I did the same thing on the other end for the connection to the muffler. Then I drilled a hole for the cable clamp, coated the mating screw thread in silicone, and attached it to keep it nice and tidy and away from all the other components. Oh yeah, feels nice. Woo-wee, I'm exhausted. Let's do a quick review. The exhaust comes down from the heater, is held by a cable clamp, and then comes down to the muffler, which is also attached to the van. Then it pipes forward just a bit more before it hugs this frame feature. This cable clamp was a complete pain in the butt to drill, but overall I'm happy with how it turned out, and the exhaust clears the pinch weld and slightly points towards the rear of the van, which means we Gucci. Longer term, I do want to figure out how to route it to the driver's side to completely eliminate the fumes at the slider door, but this is solid.
Alright, I made one last change from the night before. You can see I've actually rotated this muffler 90 degrees. I replaced the original Z bracket I used with that L bracket back there. And my thought process here is because when this was rotated 90 degrees down, it kind of created a water trap for condensation. I think this orientation is a little bit better. It will still kind of collect water down here, but ultimately not as much in the other orientation. So that's the only change I made, and that's my thought process there. All right, so now that we got the heater installed, we're gonna go ahead and mount the ducting. This will blow the hot air into the van. I want this as low as possible in this stamping, so I'm using the large side to basically find that position, and I'm offsetting about 1/8 of an inch on either side there, and then I'm gonna mark this. So I've gone ahead and I found circle center. We used the exact same method we did before, except this time I drew a 3rd line just to be sure. It's kind of a big hole. Anyways, we need to drill this out to 2 5/8 inches. Most people use a hole saw for this operation. We're a little bit more progressive in the fact that we use
dozer.
These things are notorious for making a mess, so I've also gone ahead and built this tape trap. Let's get drilling.
These larger hole saws can be a bit grabby. The key on this thin metal is to apply light and even pressure and keep it spinning. After I punched through with the hole dozer, I cleaned things up with this little bastard file and some 120 grit emery cloth. I then vacuumed up all the loose stuff and folded the tape trap in on itself. A quick little isopropyl spit shine to clean things up, and we are ready to mark the screw holes. After marking, we center punch and then drill the holes. On the left is how I measure for hole size, starting from the minor diameter to the start of the taper. I then choose a drill about 50 thousandths undersize of that value. In this case, it was a number 36 drill bit at 0.1065 inches.
We got our handy dandy Rust-Oleum, trusted quality since 1921. We sprayed it into this cup, and then we're going with the dauber again, and we're just gonna paint around these exposed areas.
Once the primer has had a chance to dry, simply attach with the 3 included pan head screws. Now it's time to hook up the elephant trunk. I sort of pre-bent the shape I wanted and dry fit it into place to get the cut length. I then used the included clamp as a guide to cut a straight line with a sharp utility knife. I then reinstalled the elephant trunk, making sure to fully seat it on the heater output. I then slid the clamp into place and tightened it to the required spec of 3 Newton meters. On the outlet side, my kit didn't come with another clamp. I might add one later, but the serrated plastic seems to hold the tube well enough.
Oh hey friends, aren't you looking pretty tubular? We're ready to wrap up this portion of the install. All we gotta do is put on this piece, which is the heater output diverter. That looks nice.
All right, so now we're gonna go ahead and hook up the wiring harness. I'm actually gonna route all wires from the passenger seat through this clamshell. I basically lifted up the flooring here, and then to get this clamshell up, you kind of just pull on each one of these clips. It's a little bit difficult, and then I just got it up enough that I can kind of see through there and get to the driver's seat. On the driver's seat, I actually unbolted this, the computer and everything here. There's 2 bolts, one in the front. Those just come off with an M10 socket head. And that allows me to see down in where this is coming into the clamshell. I'll try to get a close-up shot of that. And then down straight to the boot, which will go to the pump.
I first started by routing the pump connector, which is the one with the blue and brown leads, since it was the smallest wire. I then used that wire to pull the other 2 wires through by attaching them to it with electrical tape. I'm pulling all my wires to the driver's side because that's where all of them will terminate for our build. After all the wires were pulled through the wire duct, I went ahead and closed everything back up and covered it with the factory floor.
All right, so this thing's pretty cool. This is a Brady M210 labeling machine, and what's nice about it is it can actually print on shrink tube. So if we ever sell this van, I want people to know how to service it, what all the wires are. So I'm gonna go ahead and label the heater pump here so people know.
After I attached the cable label, I shoved the end of the wire into the weather pass-through boot, which is located under this mess of wires, which is under the computer mount in the driver's side seat box.
All right, I just pulled this cable out of this boot. This is the one under the driver's seat. I thought I was gonna have to cut this zip tie, but I was able to just work my finger in there and grab the cable because I jammed it down there. And then this just needs to go over and connect to our fuel pump here. So I'm gonna run it with zip ties along here and then into here.
Last thing here, the pump cable was insanely long, so I was able to find the part numbers for both the MCON pins as well as the weatherproofing seals. And I cut off about 10 feet of wire so I didn't have any extra that I needed to coil up somewhere. Then I inserted them into the supplied mating connector. It doesn't matter which pin as they are interchangeable, and then I connected it to the pump, wire loomed everything up, and called it a day.
All right, there you have it, friends. That wraps up another van build episode. We're gonna be covering the rest of the electrical when we do our house battery system, so you'll wanna stay tuned for that. If you have any questions about this episode, feel free to drop a comment in the comment section below. And as always, on your way down there, don't forget to slap that subscribe button. We'll see you next time.